The egg is a germ of life, with a lofty symbolic significance. It is not just a cosmogonic symbol, it is also a philosophical one. As the former, it is the Orphic egg, the world's beginning. As the latter, the philosophical egg of the medieval natural philosophers. The vessel from which, at the end of the opus alchemicum, the homunculus emerges, the spiritual, inner, and complete man. Angel's Egg, the 1985 film directed by Mamoru Oshii, is an enigmatic tour de force. It offers exiguous amounts of dialogue and challenges the viewer to scrutinize every last visual detail that lay hidden in the depths of the abyss. Therefore, my hope is to unravel these cryptic elements through psychological means to unearth the key thematic elements and the overall core message. The first image we see is a pair of child's hands that eventually morph into an adult hand. We can see this as a transformation process that is going to occur throughout the film, and how this trial will involve a certain challenge that will need to be overcome. A challenge that will be quite painful. Now, why start a film with hands of two different people? Unbeknownst to many, hands offer great insight into a person's inner psychology. We see annoyance when someone taps their fingers, provocativeness when the hands are run through hair, inner tension when they're interlocked, and hands even talk to others via emphasizing key points. In effect, the hands are inseparably linked to one's psyche, offering a great deal of information to careful observers. In the case of this film, the child's hands are free-flowing, in a state of play and discovery, whereas the adult hand is rigid, strained, and focused on a specific task. Next, we see an unhatched bird inside an egg. The heart is beating, and the eyes begin to flicker as a white light envelops the screen. We can analogize this with the world egg, which Rene Guénon noted is equivalent to the spiritual germ, that is symbolically one and the same with the heart. It also harkens to the idea of the cosmic egg, a renowned symbol that has been featured in Egyptian, Babylonian, Hindu, and Greek mythologies. The embryonic darkness represents the primeval waters of the collective unconscious, the collective unconscious being the part of the human psyche in which the archetypes reside, which manifest through symbols, mythologies, and patterns. Prior to the awakening of the conscious self, one exists within the egg, per se, an adolescent state where the ego consciousness has not fully differentiated itself from the vast layers of the unconscious realm. This is equivalent to a childlike state, where the adolescent hasn't fully acquired the I or the me. This is akin to the idea of the Ouroboros. Eric Neumann, Jungian psychologist, stated that the cyclical state represents the pre-ego dawn state, depicting the undifferentiated infancy experience of both mankind and the individual child. The next scene features a cryptic man holding an object that looks like a cross. A gigantic eye with statues of people praying descends to the surface. The eye represents the deity of this strange world, the God, if you will. In the psychological sense, the God that lives within all of us is an evolving being who has only the human psyche available for it to quote-unquote see the world. Symbols like the all-seeing eye and the eye of providence come to mind. The omniscience of such a being, through the psychological view, represents the totality of all psychic content within an individual's brain. Unfortunately, with such a disposition, God cannot directly reveal himself through us to accelerate our own psychological/spiritual growth. Hence, God's word must be passed down through logos, so as to permit the union of psychological opposites, i.e., the conscious and the unconscious. And logos comes in the way of Jesus Christ. Unsurprisingly, the girl, who will become the impetus for the movie, is found fast asleep, informing the viewer that her psychological state corresponds to the unhatched egg, a vessel that holds great potential, but ultimately resides in the domain of the collective unconscious. Throughout the movie, I'll point out the mythological motifs and primordial images that originate from this area of the psyche. The first one occurs when the girl leaves what I would describe as a cave to see a bright red sky. Red has a dual meaning. It means blood, the life force of the body, and affectivity, which refers to emotions that we can experience and display. Thus, red symbolizes the joining together of spirit and body. The dichotomy of black and red marks the differentiation between conscious and unconscious. The black color represents the alchemic nigredo, which is a dark state that is associated with death. Only through visiting the dark, ghastly nights of our own soul are we able to become more aware of our own shadow aspects. The shadow being unrecognized, unacknowledged, and shunned aspects that ultimately reach down into our animalistic desires and are often considered shameful. The problem, however, is that the shadow holds great creative potential in the way of creative impulses and can be used to one's benefit if properly integrated. To integrate such aspects, one must endure a spiritual death. The next stage is considered the whitening, albedo, represented by the girl's skin color and hair, which focuses on the communication between the unconscious and the conscious aspects of the psyche. This stage establishes a relationship with the archetypal self via bringing the unconscious energies to the conscious light, to bring cohesion to the dark and light energies, metaphorically speaking, to make the psyche whole. After one confronts the shadow through the nigredo phase and establishes a connection between the unconscious and conscious aspects of the psyche through the albedo phase, one then undergoes the citrinitis, the yellowing stage. You may notice that the yellow is not represented in this picture, and there's a reason behind this. Around the 16th century, the colors were reduced to 3, and even analytical psychologist Carl Jung compressed the rubedo, the reddening, into the end of the second phase. As you will see by the end of this movie, the yellow death marks the end of the lunar light, i.e. the unconscious, as the consciousness awakens to a newly discovered knowledge of the self. It signifies the breaking of the egg, so that the psychological yolk can expand its awareness from the interior to turn its awareness outward to the physical world. Finally, the process culminates in the return to Earth, to fully incarnate the awakened consciousness through the symbiotic fusion of heaven and earth. Conscious and unconscious are now united as one, forging the Philosopher's Stone, the individuation process, to fully realize the expression of the authentic self, the self that has existed all this time within the individual, but is now being fully expressed in the physical world. This final step is known as the reddening, and is marked as the final mortification and rebirth. With this alchemic/psychological process in mind, we can finally move forward. The next scene of note occurs when the girl fills a container with pure water. For the alchemist, the vessel is something truly marvelous. It must be completely round, in imitation of the spherical cosmos, so that the influence of the stars may contribute to the success of the operation. It is a kind of matrix or uterus from which the filius phosophorum, the philosopher's child, which is equivalent to the philosopher's stone or the individuation process, is to be born. Hence, it is required that the vessel be not only round, but egg-shaped. The round vessel is synonymous with the soul, the psyche in its totality. Water, being the commonest symbol of the unconscious, demonstrates the girl's current psychological state, that being a complete submersion at this point in the story. However, water also serves as a place of transformation. Proteus, a Greek prophetic sea god, had the ability to transform into a lion, serpent, or even a tree. Notice how the reflection of the vessel reflects the girl's head, immersed in the water, i.e. the unconscious, and displays the white tree surrounded by the darkness. The idea is that her psychological contents are distinct and separate. The inner light is shielding off the terrors of the night, but it also seems as though they're overwhelming the area. To escape a conscious confrontation with the darkness, she drinks from the waters of the unconscious to preserve her dreamlike state. Circumventing this dilemma proliferates her own psychological shadow, as noted by the expanding shadow of the tree in the waters of the unconscious. A person often meets his destiny on the road he took to avoid it. The girl is evading a troubling time in her life, and as we will see later on, she is really a fully grown adult that needs to transcend her own psychological adolescence. The tree also symbolizes the beginning and the end. the beginning of the burgeoning ego consciousness and the eventual return into the collective to reunite with the self. The girl is initiating the blackening phase in which she must confront her own shadow and the savage elements of the human psyche. The girl proceeds to roam an uninhabited city. Crumbling structures with overcast skies pervade the land. Water is everywhere, along with dragon and fish statues. A metal wiring designed like a heart demonstrates the emptiness and disregard of the girl's own heart. Think of this world as emblematic of the totality of her own psyche. Every structure and occurrence has relevance to her own inner tumult. Militaristic vehicles pass the girl by in a cyclical fashion. This ruthless, repetitive sequence harkens to the animalistic Ouroboros that resides within all of us. The instinctual urges that are often suppressed by the norms of society lie dormant within all of us. If left dormant, however, it can create an internal rot that will drain vitality and create a disconnection with society at large, leading to anxiety and depression. A mysterious man jumps from one of the vehicles, crossing the barrier of the collective unconscious, the Ouroboros, to make contact with the ego consciousness. But the serpent is also life. In the image furnished by the ancients, the serpent put an end to the childlike magnificence of paradise. They even said that Christ himself has been a serpent. The man, for all intents and purposes, is Christ, the archetypal self, and the mediator between the unconscious and the conscious realms. He thusly serves as a magnet to pull in the ego consciousness, to cultivate the state of wholeness, the Imago Dei, the image of God in man. However, the purely altruistic Christ does not perfectly emulate the psyche in its totality, as it neglects the compensatory opposite, i.e. the Antichrist, hence the necessity of the devil. In Angel's Egg, however, we will see that this man embodies both good and evil, serving as a viable representation of the self, and the Citronitis phase that brings about the Yellow Death and the awakening of the consciousness to the true self. All this is verified by the yellowish-brown cross that the man carries, with the red circle in the center, which refers to the Rubetto phase. The girl initially runs away from the burden of confronting herself, desperately clutching to the egg for comfort. This is reminiscent of the Bosch, the Garden of Earthly Delights, in which the people re-enter the metaphorical egg, the center of the unconscious energies. Unfortunately, this is the reverse of individuation. Instead of merging the unconscious energies with the conscious ones, it's seeking to submerge the conscious energies under the weight of the chthonic realms, so as to obviate reality. In such cases, we may liken this to the psychology of a man-child, or, in this case, a woman-child, who doesn't take on the responsibilities of life, inhibiting their growth to their own detriment. Behold, the secret conspiracy between mother and sons, father and daughters, and how each helps the other to betray life. The girl then finds a vessel with a red liquid, representing the reddening. Notice how she pours the liquid onto the ground, disregarding her own psychological growth. She then immediately tries to fill the vessel with water from a snake-like fountain, but the container won't fill. It seems this world is a transient residence that will eventually need to be vacated for something more authentic. A re-encounter with the Christ-like figure reminds her of her urgent task that needs to be undertaken. Keep your precious things inside you, or you will lose them. This harkens to the idea of the puer and the puella aeternus, the eternal child, who lives a provisional lifestyle and doesn't embrace the challenges of life. Think of this as the Peter Pan syndrome, describing someone who wants to remain precious, like the egg, and never truly open up to society or the real world. Now, a childlike personality can be enjoyable, and oftentimes the life of a party, but ultimately reaches the eventual roadblock of failed progress, revealing failed growth as an individual. They thus never grow up and hatch into the bird they must become. You have to break an egg if you are to know what is inside. The girl immediately runs away from this life challenge. No matter how hard she tries, however, the importance of the task follows her, and weighs down on her. She walks past bars that project a shadowy prison on her body. Inadvertently, attempts at avoiding the world creates a prison in which existential reality is a form of bondage. One cannot truly call themselves free if they are stagnated and refuse to face up to the responsibilities of growing up. The fish hunters emerge, eliciting images of man's most primal form, that of a savage hunter. They chase the shadow of a fish. The Redeemer is synonymous with the fish or a serpent, and the desperate men seek to skewer the fish. They aim to assassinate their inner Christ through force and aggression. Despite this, their attempts prove to be ineffectual. The idea is that one cannot supersede the inner workings of their mind, as they will become subservient to it if they seek total psychological dominance. If a plant is to unfold its specific nature to the full, it must first be able to grow in the soil in which it is planted. Anger also creates distinctions and boundaries, and if boundaries are broken, it precipitates revenge and possession of the shadow. Hence the reason the men are mere illusions, shadows running through the streets. The fish itself is known as a coelacanth, considered a living fossil, since it's remained relatively unchanged, dating back to its days with the dinosaurs. As such, we may liken the coelacanth to the ancient structures of the human brain that are wired for survival, i.e., the brainstem and the thalamus. The brainstem is the oldest structure of the human brain, serving to control breathing, heart rate, attention, and motor responses. The brainstem is also connected to the spinal cord on the bottom and the thalamus on top. The thalamus, coincidentally enough, is an egg-shaped structure that lies at the center of the brain, which acts as a hub to relay information. The thalamus plays a pivotal role in sleeping by shutting off incoming signals. Furthermore, recent studies investigating the mediodorsal thalamus in mice have shown that enhancing it will magnify the ability to think. Coelacanth females retain fertilized eggs within their bodies during their gestation period, which is a rarity among fish. The egg is then hatched within the female, which harkens to the man/woman child who is born in the physical world but remains within the confines of their parents' protection. And because the coelacanth is a fish that has stagnated in its evolution, it foretells of a hampered development for anyone who doesn't seek to break through the egg and branch off from their parents' supervision. We then see the Christ-like man sitting against a door that resembles the human brain. We know this by the marked line down the middle, which separates the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. The man sits in the middle, representing the archetypal self, the combination of the conscious and unconscious energies. The girl inside the cathedral begins to stare at a reflection of herself as a child. This image, none so surprisingly, pleases her. She thusly embraces her adolescence in full, while simultaneously neglecting the challenges of life, and waiting for her metaphorical ship to set sail and resolve all the ongoing issues. Yet, the shadow of the fish, the self, glides over her, signifying the impending change that must follow. In this regard, we would view the fish Jave as rebellious elements within the girl's psyche, whom are attempting to prevent the fish from enacting the necessary psychological changes, to get her out of the egg and into the world again, the necessary impetus to deliver the girl from her adolescence to adulthood. The girl begs for the man not to harm the egg, but his raison d'etre is not in line with what she wants, but eventually, it's what she needs. The man touches a stone wall with a carving of a giant tree, relating to the cosmic tree we talked about earlier. He talks about the branches clutching onto an egg with a giant bird inside. We later find out the bird is an angel. The girl wishes to hatch the egg and birth such a being. Now, with the egg representing her unhatched unconscious state, the conception of an angel would be for her to rebirth a contradiction. Angels, after all, are purely benevolent in nature, with no harboring of evil or wickedness. Such a psychological state for the girl would beget the enantiodromia, a compensatory spirit that exhibited signs of death, hence the reason we only see the angel's bones. The angels are a strange genus. They are precisely what they are and cannot be anything else. They are in themselves soulless beings who represent nothing but the thoughts and intuitions of their Lord. Aiming for the angelic life would diminish the animalistic impulses and reject the rhythms of the unconscious altogether. Angels, after all, are fanciful illusions that exist to assuage adolescence about the rigors of life. It is thusly a rejection of life and an acceptance of a weakened spirit. It would be a failed attempt at individuation and would most certainly have consequences down the line. But the Christ-like man offers hope to the girl. He recites the story of Noah's Ark, which centers on an interesting dilemma that many of us face in our lives in a symbolic sense. The idea of this story is that the Great Flood washes away the corruption and violence of the psyche. The disdain the ego consciousness feels towards its psychological opposite is thusly washed away in a torrential downpour. Of course, not everything is swept away by the massive currents. Certain vital aspects are still held onto. The metaphorical ark serves as the protective container for these attributes to help us retain our individuality. The ark also floats on the waters of the unconscious, preventing the ego consciousness from being completely submerged into the depths. Now, even though the flood myth involves the destruction of all flesh on the land, the preservation of two animals of each kind reminds the reader that the whole process is akin to rebirth. Eradicate the old, prehistoric contents so that we may bring about new life. The dove that flies away and doesn't return signifies the crux of the story. It is not known what became of the bird, because we ourselves are the bird. The birds that hatch from the captive world soul of the egg will either rise into the domain of air between heaven and earth, creating a balance and an integration of the two, or, conversely, become a fallen angel who is eliminated by God's wrath. The Christ-like man, hearing the girl's aspirations, has no other recourse. He must enact a drastic measure before the girl's dream comes crashing down. In reality, he must wake her up so as to discover the truth about who she really is. A person frozen in adolescence will never become their true self. The Christ-like man carefully grabs the egg from the bed and places it onto the ground. He methodically raises the cross into the air, bringing it to its peak. He thusly smashes the egg with the cross. By bearing the cross of incarnation, like the cosmic Christ before us, we can know the light of our inner spiritual cross of illumination, resurrection, and salvation. An outpouring of water floods the city. The rising tides remind the individual that the unconscious is vast, swift, and unyielding. Much like the water reveals the weaknesses in the infrastructure, so does the unconscious uncover the fragility of our soul, of our psyche. It may sound counterproductive to disintegrate ourselves in such a vigorous fashion, but without such an act, we can never hope to reconstruct ourselves into the stalwart people we hope to become. After all, we must perish if we hope to reincarnate our spirit. The girl finds the egg, evoking immediate despair. There is no reversing course. The deed is done, and now a choice must be made. Allow the grief to suffocate her by hanging on to the false hope of the angel, or confront the watery depths, confront the inner spirit, the inner shadow that has been lurking inside her this whole time. She runs away from the town, runs away from the collective unconscious, having gathered the necessary information to elicit the change that is needed. She then approaches the real version of herself, the version that was cast away into the watery underworld. As the two meet at the surface point of the water, the symbolic nexus point of the girl's psyche, they embrace with a soft kiss. The conscious transference permits the adult version of the girl to direct the ego consciousness henceforward. If we are to think of the girl's level of awareness throughout the movie, she existed in a psychological state known as participation mystique. This condition pervades adolescents who have yet to differentiate their consciousness from their parents, as they often establish a psychological unity with them. We can also see this in people who become overly infatuated with actors or sports athletes, forming an unconscious identity with them and becoming attached to their lives. In this girl's case, she became spellbound by the egg, placing it under her dress as if it was a part of her. The cracking of the egg was a cracking of her soul, but the girl needed this harsh reminder, for she is not the egg. She is not the angel she hoped to become. She is exactly who she is, a sleeping adult who needs to actualize the expansion of her ego consciousness and merge it with the unconscious to forge the self. People with a narrow conscious life exteriorize their unconscious. They're continually in participation mystique with other people. If more unconscious things have become conscious to you, then you live less in participation mystique. Once the kiss is complete, the adolescent version of the girl disappears, leaving only the adult woman. She sinks into the depths of the caliginous waters, into the depths of her own psychological shadow, readying herself for the delivery of a new self. She expels a mass of bubbles that ascend from the womb to greet the world in the form of an egg, in the form of potential and life. Consciousness does not create itself. It wells up from the depths. In childhood, it awakens gradually, and all through life, it wakes each morning out of the depths of sleep, from an unconscious condition. It is like a child that is born daily out of the primordial womb of the unconscious. The ripples from the egg leads us to a tree, a spiritual tree, one which harkens to the Kabbalistic tree of life, whose roots reach the chthonic realm, with branches reaching up toward heaven. Notice the difference with these eggs from the one we saw in the beginning of the movie. The original egg contained an infant bird with white roots, representing the naivety of the girl. The tree was also small in stature, and it was the only tree of its kind. The trees at the end of the movie are plentiful, representing the differentiation of the consciousness and the burgeoning of archetypal personalities that are now integrating themselves in the realm of conscious awareness. Archetypes, according to Jung, are primordial behavior patterns and are innate qualities much like instincts. This means they are prefigured tendencies that shape decisions, thought, and behavior. This may explain why people naturally root for the underdog, or why mothers are seen as nurturing and caring, or why children are viewed as innocent. If we view the girl from this lens, we can see that she fell into the innocent archetype to a T, displaying a belief in a happy ending, living a simple life, and ignoring the bad happenings around her. But the God within, through the power of Logos, i.e. the Christ-like man, cracked the archetypal egg of her innocence, so that she could receive the benefit of all the archetypal eggs within her psyche. We even see an egg that has a phallic-looking rock underneath it, representing the girl's masculine attributes and tendencies, i.e. the animus. The animus being the male component of the girl, and the anima being the female component of a male. The rising I/God/sun represents the rubedo process of the alchemic reaction we talked about in the beginning. The philosopher's stone, the individuation process, has now manifested, eliciting enlightenment and new knowledge about the self. The movie culminates with the inner god soaring up from the unconscious realm to reveal the girl set in stone. She has closed the chapter on her childhood. She has solidified her yearnings for innocence and fanciful beliefs, and has moved on to the next stage in her life. The camera pans away from the asteroid-like planet to showcase the dichotomy between light and dark, conscious and unconscious, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain, the duality of man, or, in this case, woman. In order to eat, you have to be hungry. In order to learn, you have to be ignorant. Ignorance is a condition of learning. Pain is a condition of health. Passion is a condition of thought. Death is a condition of life.